When Mark's mother passed away, it felt like the world had lost its color. She had been his anchor, the only person who truly understood his quiet nature. Mark was devastated, and in those first few weeks of grief, he looked to his wife, Chloe, for a hand to hold. They had been married for 6 years, and Mark believed they were a team. He expected a partnership where two people carry the heavy loads together. But instead of a shoulder to lean on, he found a cold, growing distance. Chloe didn't handle sorrow well. To her, grief was an inconvenience, a dark cloud that ruined her social calendar and made the house feel heavy. While Mark spent his evenings looking through old family photo albums, trying to process his loss, Chloe would stand in the doorway with her coat on, checking her watch. She began to treat his mourning like a personal insult, as if his sadness was a choice he was making just to spite her. The logic of their marriage began to fracture at the dinner table. Mark would try to talk about his mother's kindness or the memories they shared, but Chloe would quickly change the subject to her career or a new restaurant she wanted to visit. She stopped asking how he was doing and started asking when he would get back to normal. To Chloe, a husband in mourning was a husband who wasn't useful. He wasn't taking her to parties, and he wasn't the energetic man she had married. A week after the funeral, Mark noticed a change in Chloe's behavior that went beyond simple impatience. She started staying out late, claiming she couldn't stand the depressing atmosphere of their home. She told him that life was for the living and that she refused to waste her youth in a house of shadows. Mark, blinded by his own pain, initially felt guilty. He thought he was failing her by being too sad, so he tried to hide his tears and put on a brave face. But then, the small clues started to surface. Mark found a receipt for a high-end men's watch in Chloe's handbag, a brand he didn't wear. When he asked her about it, she simply said it was a retirement gift for a colleague and walked away before he could ask for a name. Then there were the phone calls. Chloe would step out onto the balcony, her voice dropping to a whisper, laughing in a way she hadn't laughed with Mark in months. The turning point came when Mark discovered that Chloe had already started looking for apartments. He found a browser tab left open on their shared computer for a luxury condo downtown, a place meant for one person, or perhaps a couple, but certainly not a family. The realization hit him that while he was mourning his mother, his wife was busy planning her exit. She wasn't waiting for him to get better. She was waiting for the right moment to leave. Everything reached a boiling point on a Tuesday evening. Mark was sitting in the living room, holding a small, sealed envelope his mother had given him just days before she passed. He hadn't opened it yet, fearing the finality of her words. Chloe walked in, dressed in a stunning red dress that looked far too bright for the room. She didn't offer a hug or a kind word. Instead, she sat across from him and told him that she couldn't do this anymore. She said that a person only gets one life, and she refused to spend hers drowning in his sorrow. As she spoke, she looked at the envelope in his hand with a flicker of curiosity, but her disdain was stronger. She told him she was moving out that night to stay with a friend who actually knew how to enjoy life. Mark watched her walk toward the door, his heart breaking not just for his mother, but for the 6 years he had wasted on a woman who only loved him when things were easy. But as the door slammed shut, Mark finally tore open the envelope. Inside wasn't just a letter of comfort. It was a copy of a notarized document. His mother, who had always been quietly wealthy from a family inheritance she never talked about, had left a specific bequest. Chloe had always assumed Mark's mother was a simple pensioner with nothing to her name. She was wrong. The document stated that the sum of $500,000 was to be transferred directly to Mark's private account upon her death, with one specific condition. The money was for Mark and his future alone, and it was to be kept strictly separate from any marital assets. Mark sat in the silence of the empty house, the document in his hand. He realized that Chloe had walked out just 2 hours before the bank's notification would have arrived. She had traded a fortune and a loyal husband for a new life because she couldn't handle a few weeks of his tears. But as Mark looked closer at the document, he saw a handwritten note from his mother at the bottom. The note contained the name of the friend Chloe had been seeing, a name that proved this betrayal had started long before the funeral. Mark didn't call her. He didn't beg her to come back, and he didn't tell her about the money. He simply sat in the quiet house and let the logic of the situation sink in. Chloe had left him at his lowest point, choosing a man she thought offered a brighter life. Mark realized that if he told her about the $500,000 now, she would be back in an hour with a tearful apology. He didn't want an apology. He wanted to see who she really was when the masks were off. Over the next few days, Mark began his investigation. The name his mother had written in the note was Julian, a wealthy, arrogant developer who had been a casual acquaintance of theirs. Mark checked his mother's old phone logs and found that Julian had actually called her several times weeks before she passed. It turned out that Julian had been pressuring Mark's mother to sell her small plot of land near the coast, and when she refused, he had shifted his focus to the weakest link in the family, Chloe. Mark realized with a cold clarity that Chloe hadn't just found a new man. She had been recruited. Julian had seduced her with the promise of a life without sorrow, likely hoping that once Mark's mother passed, Chloe would inherit the land and hand it over to him. They were both vultures circling a grief-stricken man. Instead of hiding, Mark decided to attend a high-profile charity gala that weekend, an event he knew Chloe and Julian would attend to debut their new relationship. He used a small portion of his inheritance to buy a perfectly tailored suit and hired a private driver. He wasn't going there to cause a scene. He was going there to observe. When Mark walked into the ballroom, he saw them immediately. Chloe was glowing in a dress that probably cost more than their last 3 mortgage payments. She was clinging to Julian's arm, laughing at something he said. When she spotted Mark, her expression didn't soften with guilt. Instead, she looked at him with a mix of pity and annoyance. She walked over to him, leaving Julian for a moment, and told him he shouldn't be there. She whispered that he looked lost and that he was only embarrassing himself by trying to follow her. Mark didn't get angry. He simply smiled, a calm, genuine smile that caught her off guard. He told her he wasn't there for her, but to settle some final estate matters. He mentioned, quite casually, that his mother's lawyers had finally finished the paperwork. Chloe's eyes narrowed. She asked if there was anything left of the old woman's belongings worth selling. Mark leaned in and told her that there was a significant piece of news regarding the inheritance, but since they were no longer together, he supposed it didn't matter. He then turned his back on her and walked toward the bar, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, the first seeds of greed beginning to sprout in her mind. The pressure began to build that night. Chloe couldn't help herself. She started texting him, asking what he meant about the news. Mark didn't reply. He knew that for someone like Chloe, silence was the ultimate torture. The next morning, Mark received a visit from the private investigator he had hired. The investigator handed him a folder that contained the knife in the back. It wasn't just that Chloe was cheating. It was that she and Julian had been planning to declare Mark mentally unfit due to his extreme grief to take control of his mother's estate before she even died. They had been trying to steal from a dying woman and a mourning son at the same time. Mark felt a wave of cold fury, but he kept his emotions in check. He had the money, he had the evidence, and now he had a plan. He sent a single message to Chloe. "I'm going to the bank tomorrow to finalize the $500,000 transfer. I guess you were right, life is for the living." The response was instantaneous. Chloe called him 10 times in a row. When he finally answered, her voice was completely different. The sorrow she couldn't handle before was now replaced by a frantic, artificial sweetness. She told him she had made a huge mistake, that the stress of the funeral had made her lose her mind, and that she wanted to come home and help him manage the new responsibilities. But Mark knew the final piece of the puzzle. He had found a loophole in the land deed Julian wanted so badly. The land wasn't just a plot of dirt. It sat directly on top of a planned government infrastructure project. It was worth millions, but only if the owner signed by the end of the month. Mark told Chloe she could come over to talk, but only if Julian came too. He told her he wanted closure. The hook for this part was the moment they arrived at the house. Chloe and Julian walked in, looking like a power couple ready to negotiate. But sitting on the coffee table wasn't a reconciliation agreement. It was a set of photos showing Julian meeting with another woman, Julian's actual wife, whom Chloe didn't even know existed. Mark looked at Chloe and told her that, while she was busy betraying a grieving husband, her new man was busy making sure she would never see a dime of his money either. He then turned to Julian and told him that he had already sold the land to Julian's biggest competitor for a fraction of the price, just to ensure Julian's project would fail. As Chloe realized she had lost the husband, the inheritance, and her secret lover's loyalty all in one breath, the front door opened. Two men in dark suits stepped in. They weren't police, they were process servers. Mark looked at Chloe and told her she wasn't just being divorced, she was being sued for fraud. The atmosphere in the room turned ice cold. Chloe looked from the process servers to the photos of Julian's secret wife, her mouth hanging open. The bright future Julian had promised her was evaporating in real time. Julian, meanwhile, was staring at the documents regarding the land sale. His face went from arrogant to a sickly shade of gray. By selling that land to his rival, Mark hadn't just made a profit, he had effectively sabotaged Julian's entire development firm. Mark stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look like the broken, grieving man Chloe had abandoned a week ago. He looked like someone who had finally stepped out of the shadows. He explained to Chloe that her biggest mistake wasn't the affair, it was her timing. If she had stayed by his side for just one more month, if she had shown even a shred of genuine human compassion during his mother's funeral, she would have shared in the $500,000 and the eventual millions from the land. But greed has a way of blinding people to the long game. Chloe had been so focused on Julian's flashy car and expensive promises that she didn't realize she was trading a diamond for a piece of glass. Julian tried to salvage this situation, turning to Chloe and claiming that the photos were a lie, that he was in the middle of a divorce, but the process servers interrupted him. They weren't just there for Chloe, they handed Julian a separate summons. It turned out Mark's private investigator had found evidence that Julian had used company funds to buy the luxury condo Chloe was staying in. Chloe turned on Julian instantly. The love that was supposed to save her from sorrow vanished, replaced by a desperate, ugly survival instinct. She began to scream at him, accusing him of ruining her life and tricking her. It was a pathetic sight to predators realizing they had walked into a trap, now tearing at each other to find a way out. Mark didn't stay to watch the end of the argument. He walked out of the room, leaving them to their chaos. However, as he reached the hallway, he realized that a cornered animal is the most dangerous. He heard Julian's voice drop from a scream to a low, menacing hiss. Julian wasn't just worried about the money anymore. He was worried about his freedom. As the process servers led them toward the door, Chloe looked back at Mark. The shock was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating look in her eyes. She wasn't ready to give up. She whispered something to Julian, and for a split second, the two of them stopped arguing and shared a look of mutual, desperate understanding. Mark watched through the window as they were escorted to the sidewalk, but he felt a nagging sense of unease. He had won the first round, but he had also exposed his hand. He had shown them exactly how much he knew and how much he was worth. Instead of driving away, Chloe and Julian stood by Julian's car, ignoring the legal papers in their hands and talking intensely. Mark realized that by revealing the $500,000 and the land sale, he hadn't just punished them, he had given them a new reason to target him. They were no longer just looking for a way out, they were looking for a way back in, and they were willing to go much further than a simple affair to get it. The battle for his mother's legacy was far from over. In fact, as he saw Julian pick up his phone and make a hurried call while pointing back at the house, Mark realized the real danger was only just beginning. Chloe didn't leave the sidewalk quietly. As the reality of her situation set in, no Julian, no luxury condo, and no inheritance, she realized that she had played her hand too early. But instead of feeling remorse, she felt a burning sense of injustice. In her mind, she had invested 6 years into Mark, and she wasn't about to walk away empty-handed. She spent the next 48 hours in a cheap motel, fueled by caffeine and spite, trying to find a hole in Mark's defense. She decided to play the only card she had left, public sympathy. She contacted a local tabloid journalist, spinning a story about a grieving widow referring to herself as the grieving daughter-in-law who was being heartlessly evicted by a husband who had changed the moment he came into money. She wanted to create enough social pressure to force Mark into a settlement. She thought that, because Mark was a quiet, private man, he would pay her just to make the noise stop. But Chloe's logic was flawed because she still viewed Mark as the man he was before the funeral. She didn't realize that the man who had been broken by grief had been replaced by a man who had nothing left to fear. When the journalist called Mark for a comment, Mark didn't panic. He didn't offer money. Instead, he invited the journalist to his office and handed over a digital folder. Inside that folder were the GPS logs from Chloe's car for the 3 months before his mother died. They showed her car parked at Julian's estate at times when she told Mark she was at the grocery store or visiting a sick friend. There were also records of her attempting to change the beneficiary on Mark's mother's small life insurance policy while the old woman was still in a coma. The journalist didn't write a story about a heartless husband. He wrote a story about a black widow who was trying to rob a dying woman. The public backlash was immediate and brutal. Chloe's social circle, the people she had worked so hard to impress, vanished overnight. She was blocked from the country clubs and the high-end boutiques. She found herself truly alone, realizing that without Mark's reputation and stability, she was nothing more than a ghost in the city. Meanwhile, Julian was fighting his own battles. The audit Mark had triggered was uncovering more than just embezzlement. It was revealing a web of bribery involving the very government project Julian was banking on. In a desperate move to save himself, Julian called Chloe. He didn't call to apologize. He called because he knew she had a spare key to Mark's private study. He promised her that if she could get him the original land deed Mark had signed with his rival, he could fix everything and they could still run away together. Chloe, blinded by the hope of reclaiming her status, fell for the lie. On a rainy Friday night, she returned to the house she had once called home. She used her old key, which Mark hadn't changed yet, or so she thought. She crept into the study, her heart racing, searching for the document that would buy her back into Julian's favor. She found the safe open. Inside, there was no deed. There was only a single, small digital clock counting down from 10 seconds. The front door didn't just lock. It was electronically sealed. The lights in the study flickered on, and Mark's voice came through the house's security speakers. He wasn't even in the house. He was miles away, watching her through the security cameras he had installed the day she left. He told her that he knew Julian would send her, and he knew she would come, because she was as predictable as she was greedy. Then came the final shock of the night. Mark told her to look at the monitor on his desk. It showed a live feed of Julian's office. But Julian wasn't alone. He was sitting with the police, and he was currently signing a statement that claimed Chloe was the mastermind behind the entire embezzlement scheme. Julian was trading her life for a lighter sentence. Chloe sat on the floor of the study, surrounded by the silence of the house she had betrayed. She realized that she had been a pawn for 2 different men, one who wanted to protect her and one who wanted to use her. And now, she had lost them both. The sirens didn't take long to reach the house. As Chloe sat on the floor of the study, the flashing lights reflected off the family photos she had so casually ignored for years. She realized that Mark hadn't just predicted her move. He had orchestrated a scenario where her own greed became her prison. When the officers entered, they didn't find a woman who had found her way home. They found a trespasser in the middle of an attempted theft. Caught on high-definition video, the next few months were a master class in the slow grind of justice. Julian's attempt to pin everything on Chloe failed miserably. The digital recorder David had used, combined with the bank records Mark had meticulously organized, proved that Julian was the architect of the fraud. Chloe was seen for exactly what she was, a willing accomplice who had traded her integrity for the promise of a luxury lifestyle. Julian was sentenced to 8 years for financial crimes, while Chloe received a shorter, but equally devastating, sentence for her role in the conspiracy. But for Mark, the real story wasn't about the courtrooms or the headlines. It was about the day the final legal ties were cut. He stood in his lawyer's office, signing the last of the divorce papers. The lawyer mentioned that Chloe had tried one final, desperate plea from behind bars. She had asked for a small monthly allowance from the estate, claiming she had emotional trauma from the marriage. Mark didn't even read the request. He simply pushed it back across the table and shook his head. With the $500,000 and the proceeds from the land sale, Mark did something that Chloe would never have understood. He didn't buy a yacht or a mansion. He bought the old, crumbling community center where his mother used to volunteer. He spent a year renovating it, turning it into a sanctuary for people who had lost their way, a place where grief was respected, not rushed. He hired counselors and created programs for young people who had lost their parents, ensuring that his mother's spirit of quiet kindness lived on in every brick of the building. The moral of Mark's journey was etched into the very foundation of his new life. Loyalty isn't something you give when it's convenient. It's the only thing that matters when everything else falls apart. Chloe had believed that you can't spend your whole life in sorrow, but she failed to realize that sorrow is often the fire that reveals the true strength of a man's character. By running away from the shadow, she lost the right to stand in the light. A year later, a small, faded letter arrived at the community center. It was from Chloe, written on prison stationery. She didn't ask for money this time. She asked if he could ever forgive her. She wrote about how Julian had never written to her once, and how she spent every night thinking about the house they had shared. She said she finally understood that the bright life she wanted was actually the one she had burned down. Mark read the letter twice. He didn't feel anger anymore, and he didn't feel joy at her suffering. He felt a profound sense of peace. He took a pen and wrote a short note back, but he didn't send it to the prison. Instead, he walked to his mother's grave, placed the note among the flowers, and walked away. The note said, "The sorrow is gone, but the truth remains. I have finally found the life you wanted for me." Mark drove home, the late afternoon sun warming his face. He realized that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing Chloe lose everything. It was building a life so full of meaning that her betrayal no longer had the power to hurt him. He had taken a knife in the back and used it to carve out a future that was honest, stable, and finally, truly happy.